Picture this. It's 2019, and there are nearly 9,000 craft breweries operating across America. Walk down any hip neighborhood street and you'll find a local taproom packed with people, craft beer festivals selling out in hours, and enthusiasts debating the merits of hazy IPAs versus sour ales. The craft beer industry was valued at over $28 billion, and everyone wanted in on the action. But just 5 years later, in 2024, 399 craft breweries closed their doors permanently. By 2025, the industry shed another 83 breweries. We're watching one of America's most beloved beverage revolutions collapse in real time. Half of all new breweries now fail within their first 5 years. This isn't a slowdown. This is a crisis. In this video, I'm going to explain exactly how the craft beer industry went from unstoppable growth to mass extinction. I'll show you the business model that made growth seem effortless, the hidden flaw that was there from day one, and the perfect storm of economic forces that turned a thriving industry into a bloodbath. And if you stick around until the end, I'll show you what I found when I visited one of these closed breweries. What I saw there will change how you think about this entire story. Let me take you back to the early 2000s. American beer was a wasteland. Budweiser, Coors, Miller, these massive corporations had spent decades convincing Americans that beer should taste like water. It was cheap, it was everywhere, and it was exactly the same from coast to coast. Then something shifted. A small group of passionate brewers started doing the opposite of everyone else. Instead of brewing for maximum efficiency, they brewed for flavor. Instead of national distribution, they focused on local communities. Instead of lowest common denominator, they made beer that was bold, experimental, weird. The timing was perfect. Millennials were entering their drinking years, and they didn't want their parents' beer. They wanted authenticity. They wanted to support local businesses. They wanted an experience, not just a beverage. And most importantly, they were willing to pay more for something that felt real. People were hungry for this. A craft brewery wasn't just a place to drink. It was a third place between work and home. It was community. Walk into a taproom in 2012, and you'd find software engineers sitting next to construction workers, all united by their appreciation for a perfectly crafted West Coast IPA. If you like my video, please subscribe my channel. The big beer companies couldn't replicate this even if they tried. They had the money, they had the distribution, but they didn't have the soul. When Anheuser-Busch tried to buy their way into craft beer, enthusiasts could smell the inauthenticity a mile away. The craft brewers had something that couldn't be manufactured. They were the genuine article. Here's what made craft breweries grow faster than anyone thought possible. The business model was almost perfectly designed for rapid expansion. Unlike traditional businesses that needed massive capital and complex supply chains, a craft brewery could start small. A few steel fermentation tanks, some basic brewing equipment, and a taproom where you sold directly to customers. No distributors taking their cut. No retailers marking up your product. You made the beer on Tuesday, and you sold it on Friday, often for 3 to 4 times what it cost to produce. And here's the beautiful part. The model was infinitely scalable. Once you proved the concept in one neighborhood, you could replicate it in another. Different city, same formula, local branding, community focus, quality ingredients, and that all-important taproom experience. The barriers to entry seemed low. You didn't need to be a corporate giant. In fact, being small was your advantage. Customers actively preferred supporting the little guy. Every new brewery that opened created more awareness for craft beer as a category, which helped everyone. Cheap capital made it even easier. Interest rates in the 2010s were historically low. Banks loved the craft beer story. It was local, it was trendy, and early movers were showing incredible returns. Want to open a brewery? Here's a loan. Want to expand into distribution? Here's more money. The growth became exponential. In 2012, there were about 2,400 craft breweries in America. By 2019, that number had quadrupled to nearly 9,000. That's adding roughly 1,000 new breweries every single year. By 2019, craft beer had conquered America. Major sporting events featured craft beer sponsorships. Celebrities were investing in breweries. Grocery stores that once dedicated maybe 10 feet of shelf space to craft beer now had entire aisles. The revenue numbers were staggering. The industry was worth $28.9 billion in retail value. Craft beer controlled nearly 25% of all beer retail dollars in America. Think about that. 1 in every $4 spent on beer went to small, independent breweries. The culture had shifted completely. Ordering a Bud Light at a nice restaurant had become almost embarrassing. If you weren't drinking craft, you weren't informed. Beer rating apps like Untappd turned drinking into a competitive sport, with people chasing limited releases and rare barrel-aged stouts. If you like my video, please subscribe my channel. Investors couldn't get enough. Private equity firms were buying up successful breweries, convinced they could scale the model even further. Some breweries were being valued at multiples that would make tech startups jealous. Walk into any trendy neighborhood in 2019, and you'd find breweries packed every night of the week. Trivia nights, live music, food trucks parked outside. These places had become the beating heart of their communities. The idea that this could end seemed impossible. Craft beer wasn't just a trend anymore. It was American culture. But there was something dangerous hiding beneath all that success, something that had been there from the very beginning. The low barriers to entry that made growth so easy? They worked both ways. If you could open a brewery with relatively little experience and some bank financing, so could everyone else. And everyone else did. Most brewery founders weren't business people. They were passionate brewers who loved craft beer. They understood fermentation schedules and hop varieties, but many had never read a financial statement. They had no formal business training. They were artists running businesses, and that combination rarely ends well. The profit margins that looked so good on paper? They were thinner than most founders realized. Yes, you could sell a pint for $7 when it cost you $1.50 to make. But that calculation didn't account for the $500,000 in equipment costs, the rent on your building, the staff you needed to run the taproom, the spoilage, the seasonal fluctuations, and the constant need to create new beers to keep customers interested. And there was another problem that nobody wanted to talk about. Beer preferences are fickle. The IPA that was revolutionary in 2015 was boring by 2018. Customers didn't want your flagship beer anymore. They wanted the limited edition barrel-aged sour you released once a year. Breweries found themselves in an innovation arms race that was expensive and exhausting. This all worked fine when the market was growing at 20% per year. But what happens when growth slows? What happens when you have more breweries than the market can support? Nobody asked these questions in 2019, but they should have. The first crack appeared so quietly that most people missed it. Around 2020, industry veterans started noticing something. The market was saturated. Some cities had more breweries per capita than they had coffee shops. The math simply didn't work anymore. Then COVID-19 hit, and everything accelerated. Suddenly, taprooms, the entire foundation of the craft brewery business model, were forced to close. Remember, most craft breweries made the majority of their money selling directly to customers in their taprooms. Margins on distributed beer were much thinner. When taprooms shut down, breweries lost their economic engine overnight. Some pivoted to canning and home delivery, but that required equipment many didn't have and expertise they hadn't developed. The breweries that survived 2020 limped into 2021 carrying massive new debts. But here's where it gets worse. Consumer behavior had changed. Even when taprooms reopened, attendance didn't return to pre-COVID levels. People had discovered other things to do with their Thursday nights. The habit was broken. Then the economy shifted. Inflation kicked in hard in 2022 and 2023. Suddenly, everything cost more. The aluminum for cans increased by 25% when tariffs hit imported metals. Hops, malt, labor, energy, CO2 supplies, every single input became more expensive. Breweries were getting crushed on the cost side. And they couldn't raise prices to compensate because consumers were getting squeezed too. When people have less discretionary income, they make choices. A $7 craft beer versus a $12 six-pack of Budweiser? Lots of people started choosing the Budweiser. Craft beer, which had positioned itself as premium, was now seen as overpriced. Competition intensified in ways nobody expected. Hard seltzers exploded onto the scene. White Claw alone grabbed more market share in 2 years than most craft breweries could achieve in a decade. Then came ready-to-drink cocktails. Then THC beverages in states where cannabis was legal. Then non-alcoholic craft beers for the sober-curious movement. The shelf space in liquor stores started shrinking. Retailers looked at their craft beer sections, 50 different IPAs that each sold a few cases per month, and replaced them with seltzers that actually moved. Distribution became a nightmare. Big beer companies had spent decades building relationships with distributors. They started locking craft breweries out of the best accounts. In the UK, this got so bad that major pub chains signed exclusive deals with multinational brewers, completely freezing out independent craft breweries. If you like my video, please subscribe my channel. Meanwhile, the breweries kept multiplying. In 2024, there were 501 brewery closures but also 434 new openings. Even in a collapsing market, people were still betting their life savings on the dream. The net loss was 67 breweries, But that doesn't capture the chaos. Hundreds of closures and hundreds of openings means hundreds of families financially devastated and hundreds more about to be. The mismanagement became impossible to hide. Breweries that had expanded to multiple locations found themselves overextended. Poor financial planning meant cash flow problems. Inventory was mismanaged, too much of beer that wouldn't sell, not enough of styles that would. Some owners just didn't know how to run a business, and in a growing market, you could hide that. In a shrinking market, incompetence was fatal. The moment everything became irreversible happened quietly in late 2023 and early 2024. Interest rates spiked. The Federal Reserve, trying to fight inflation, raised rates to levels not seen in over a decade. For craft breweries, this was catastrophic. Remember all that cheap capital from the 2010s? Those loans came due, and now refinancing meant interest rates that were 2 or 3 times higher. A brewery that had been barely profitable was now drowning in debt service. Banks stopped lending to breweries. The risk profile had changed completely. What looked like a sure bet in 2018 looked like a terrible investment in 2024. If you needed capital to survive, you weren't getting it. At the same time, the excise taxes increased, adding yet another operational burden. Energy costs spiked. Transportation costs rose. The cumulative weight of all these factors hit simultaneously. For 21st Amendment Brewery in San Francisco, a craft beer pioneer that had been operating since 2000, the numbers just stopped working. Their sales had dropped 20% annually since 2021. That's not a temporary dip, that's a death spiral. In 2024, they announced they were shutting down. If a well-established brewery with name recognition and decades of experience couldn't survive, what chance did smaller operations have? The closures accelerated through 2024 and into 2025. In Texas alone, production dropped 8.7%, with more closures than openings. Central Texas saw beloved breweries like Tanglefoot and Last Stand shut their doors. Freetail Brewing closed one of its 2 taprooms. By the end of 2024, the United States had lost a net 118 breweries, dropping from 9,730 to 9,612. But that actually understates the problem because 2024 saw 501 closures offset slightly by 434 new openings. In 2025, the decline continued, with estimates putting operating breweries at around 9,269. The statistics are grim. Craft beer volume dropped 5% year-over-year by mid-2025. Production fell 4% in 2024, the largest drop since the pandemic. Each closure followed a similar pattern. First, the layoffs. Brewers, servers, managers, people who had built their lives around these businesses found themselves unemployed in an industry that was contracting. Then the bankruptcy filings or quiet closings. Sometimes a fire sale of equipment. Sometimes just locked doors and a sign thanking the community. The ripple effects extended far beyond the breweries themselves. Suppliers who specialized in craft beer equipment saw demand vanish. Hop farmers lost buyers. Label printers, keg manufacturers, food trucks that relied on brewery crowds, all of them felt the pain. Neighborhoods lost their gathering spaces. That brewery that hosted trivia on Tuesday nights? Gone. The place where the running club met on Saturdays? These weren't just businesses shutting down. These were community anchors disappearing. If you like my video, please subscribe my channel.